I
Right.
started recording.
There you go. Good. I didn't have the right level this morning. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Hank Welch. I'm the feeding lead for the state of Illinois for the Red Cross. Been doing this for about 2 years. I work with Jamie Winterbottom, very close. She pretty much handles response areas 4, 5, and 6, and I handle response areas 1, 2, and 3. We work as a team, and we have probably 45 or 50 people on the feeding team spread out across the state of Illinois. Kind of wanted to introduce you to what the feeding team does, what's our focus, and then ask any questions, and I'll give you a couple things to think about when we are feeding clients. And I recognize a couple people's names, so we've worked together in the past over the last few large DRs. In the past year and a half, we've had about 10 DRs, starting very close to a multifamily fire in Joliet, and then the derecho that was the next week. In fact, I don't think we had a day breather after we were finishing up this big fire in Joliet. Then the derecho hit, or it was vice versa. I can't remember. But what does the feeding team do? There's different responses that we get involved with. Single family fires, the DAT team pretty much is responsible for providing snacks and water. They only usually see the family for maybe an hour, hour and a half at the most. So that team hopefully has some water and snacks and helps them out there. We don't really get involved in single family fires. Then things start ramping up. Multifamily fires, we've been involved with many large apartment fires over the past 3 or 4 years. Once multifamily fire starts ramping up and we're identifying that there's going to be a large number of displaced clients, we set up a reception center. Can anybody give me a good definition of what the reception center is? Okay, no responses. Reception center is a place where we move the clients to. Usually it might be, if it was in an apartment complex, their management office, or an area that is common that they can use, that they open up for us, primarily just to get them out of the weather, get them, it's either too hot or too cold, or it's rainy. And that's where we interview each person to determine what their needs are, and we're scoping out whether or not we need to set up a shelter. At that point, within 2 hours, we're going to have coffee, we're going to have snacks, we're going to have water for the clients while we get some basic information from the people. Yasmin, you had your hand up?
Yes, I just wanted to mention that Georgia had said it's the client intake area.
Yes, great. And was that on the chat?
Yes, it was.
Okay, there it is. I wasn't, I didn't have the chat on. Sorry about that. Thank you. So that would be the first time that the feeding team would be called. In fact, we would be notified of the multifamily fire really when the DAT teams are responding and arriving on the scene. We're notified if it looks like it is a growing concern event, then someone in the feeding team would start looking out for coffee and water and snacks. Within a couple hours of that, the shelter team would be involved, that we would be setting up shelter. They'd be looking for a shelter to, basically set up. At that point, we would start searching for sources for meals, and we'd be getting kind of a good idea in terms of numbers. How many meals are we going to need for the next mealtime? And usually within 6 hours, the feeding team has determined where the first meal is going to be coming from. Yasmin, you have another comment?
Well, I'm not sure. Do you want to have your camera on? And are you presenting anything?
No, this is just a talk discussion. There's no slides, and I'm at a computer that does not have a camera.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's all right. Thank you. The first meal is going to be fast food sourced. Most of our restaurants that we have agreements with to provide foods in a disaster need at least 12 hours for the first meal. So for the first 6 to 10 hours, we'll be using fast food sources like McDonald's, like Burger King, Popeyes, things like that. While the shelter team is interviewing these people, what can anybody think of what they'll be asking in terms of food, about meals? Any comments?
We have someone type in, Hank.
I see. Okay. Valerie, dietary restrictions. Exactly. After the first meal, we are going to be sourcing food based on each client's needs, and we're looking at allergies, food restrictions, food preferences, if they are vegan, vegetarian, if they have a religious feeding rule that they have to follow. Challah is a big one in the Chicago area that we watch for. And after the first 6 hours, we will start sourcing out food that meets the vegetarian or any of the religious or dietary restrictions that I have to follow. Some of it is celiac disease is another big one, and also diabetes. We try and have more protein and less carbs for some foods. And also we look at salt restrictions. So if someone has an issue with salt intake, then we would provide a meal that would be lower in salt. We try and produce or provide 1,600 to 2,000 calories per day, which is a balanced diet. And an example that we had this morning from Danny Portman was that he was at one location that there were minor children or young adults, and the food was not sufficient. And they did a calorie count, and it was only 800 per day. And that is why they kept on saying, hey, we need more food, we need more food. They evaluated where they were getting the food and brought up the calorie count up to 1,600. So there's a lot of things that we have to think about in feeding. The other thing that we do outside of feeding is also canteening. If a first responder unit calls and says that they've been at a fire for 5 hours and requests a meal, we will source that meal out and provide it and deliver it to firefighters at the scene. Or if it was a search and rescue, we'd get a count of how many searchers are out there or first responders and provide meals. Yasmin, you have your hand up again?
Yes. Georgia is asking, where do we get the food?
Okay. For the first few hours, it would be a fast food. So where the first thing we look at is where is the event located? We use Google Maps for that. And we look to see, using Google Maps, what are the close restaurants to the disaster. And contact, if it's a regular restaurant and it looks like it, they should be open, we could contact them and say, hey, we need 20 meals. How are you able to do that? How soon can we get it? That's pretty much why we go for fast food. Is fast food can give us 50 hamburgers in 30 minutes and without a problem. Not the best food, not the great food, but it's something. And that's why we go for fast food for the first 6 hours. After that, we have also many or several handfuls of restaurants across each response area that we have agreements with, and we continually build that list. We're trying to have at least 3 or 4 in every county, if that's possible. And in Chicago, we'll have about 12 or 15 different sources. And we have contacted them during Blue Sky. We know what their notification time is for meals, how many meals they can produce per meal, if they can do both lunch and dinner or breakfast, what choices we would have. One of our biggest members of that group is the Evanston Meals on Wheels program. They have a commercial kitchen, and they can produce for us. I think we've done 300 meals for lunch and 400 meals for dinner through them in one day. Other sources, it just depends on where the disaster is located. And we also look for allergies, for anybody that has dietary restrictions. They will go to somebody else. If somebody has a celiac disease, salads are a good source, at least for the first couple days or first day. So we'll go to Panera and get salads. Each day is different, each meal is different, and we try and mix it up from different sources so you're not getting hamburgers every single day for 3 days. And then after the first day, then we pretty much go to restaurants or caterers for meals, and we don't use the fast food outlets. And that allows us to prepare or provide varied meals, so they're not the same meal. And a lot of those caterers can also address for us very easily any feeding restrictions that we might have. Sometimes, however, we'll deal with 2 or even 3 sources of meals to cover all of these different food requirements. Anybody have any questions so far? Valerie, you've helped us quite a bit on the feeding team over the last couple of years. Do you have any comments or thoughts? And I also you went down to Louisiana during the summer. Any ideas or thoughts about that?
I would just say that every event is always a little bit different. I have gone out on a feeding call where they had lost their clients, so I put a shelter down instead. When I did Louisiana, I learned to drive an Irv and drove that down to Baton Rouge, which was a completely different experience than the ones that I had had locally. So I just really would say that every experience is a little bit different. You just have to be patient because there's a lot of adjustment for each situation. But I also find that it was really rewarding on all the different things I've done.
Okay. Tanya, you have a question. The volunteers fed the same food, or they buy their own? No, we feed all of the volunteers. Anybody that's supporting the shelters are fed, and all of the clients. In addition to that, we also do, in a large event, the Naperville tornado that was last summer. We had a shelter set up in one of the middle schools, and we had our operations office also at that school. So we served meals 3 times a day for all of the volunteers. Some of the school staff was fed because they were supporting the school, keeping it open, keeping it clean. And the shelter clients that were there were fed. And we also had a separate resource center for the first responders, where we had also food and snacks and water. So we fed first responders there. After about 5 days, we set up what was called a mutual agency resource center, and we had about 1,500 people go through in 2 days. So anybody that was affected by that tornado was able to go to that middle school and talk to different agencies. We had a cafeteria line that we served everybody in the resource center. All of the people that staffed the different agencies were fed. So we feed everybody that's been affected or helping out on an event like this. Tanya, did that answer the question?
Yes.
Good. Okay. All right. We fed over 2 days almost 3,000 meals. That was over a year ago at that tornado, and it was very, very, very different. But getting to the level that Valerie was talking about, where it's a major DR, and everyone is different. Any other questions? So, if you want to be part of the feeding team, over the last 2 years, we were the most active team of the responders. And if you go on the exchange, just type in feeding team or feeding gap, and it will give you the information that you need in terms of classes that you might take. There's primarily 4 pertaining to feeding. Most of them are 2 of them are for food safety, and also for just an overview of what the feeding team does. There's Jasmine. I think there's another question in the chat.
Correct.
Okay.
It's when you have a moment, can you discuss how canteening works?
Absolutely. The term canteening started during World War II. Might have actually been World War I, where the Red Cross would deliver donuts and coffee to the frontline soldiers. And what we do is that if a first responder, a county emergency management agency calls us and says there's a big response in this specific town, we get a kind of a count of all of the different first responders that are at the scene, and then we will provide water, if it's hot out, sports drinks, Gatorade. If they require meals, we'll get them meals, just so that they have some resources for all of that. The last one was just a few weeks ago. It was search and rescue up in Lake County, and someone was missing in a very remote area in Lake County, and we served about 60 people for lunch. And so sometimes that's how we get involved with canteening. A lot of large fires. So that's what canteening does. Once we get kind of released from the COVID restrictions, a lot of times what will happen now is that we'll go down to Chicago if we have the time, get the ERV, Emergency Resource Vehicle, Response Vehicle, and set up shop at the location where the canteening is required, and serve food out of that vehicle. Up until now, what we've done is we found a local volunteer to pick up food at one of the restaurants, and water and snacks, whatever is needed, and then deliver it to the response site and drop off the meals there. And there's usually 2 or 3 support people that are supporting the first responders there that aren't Red Crossers, and they hand out the meals. So that's pretty much what canteening does. Short term, usually it's less than 4 or 5 hours. Usually it's an hour at the most. It all just depends on what type of response that is. Good example on canteening. Last summer, we had 2 major fire events that we responded to. One was north of Rockford at a grease production plant. You remember that. The plant burned for 3 days, and we provided food for the first responders for all 3 days, along with a shelter. I think that was in the town of Rockton. A week after that, Morris, Illinois had a bad battery storage facility that caught fire, and it was lithium batteries, and they declared a 1-mile radius evacuation center, and we set up a shelter as well, and fed that was about 300 responders. We fed them for 2 days. I'll tell you, when you come up to a scene where everybody's been fighting a fire for 3 or 4 hours and you have lunch, everybody is so happy. The first responders are so happy. You get a lot of kudos. Okay, all right. Any other questions? So when we're feeding, we're thinking about allergies, food preferences, religions, things like that. The other thing that's very, very important is food safety. And one of the first, I asked a question early on this morning to the head speaker from National, asking about packaged meals. And apparently they have just changed the rules. We don't have to have individually packed lunches and dinners like we've had for the last 2.5 years. And so we'll be able to go out to a restaurant and get a large amount of spaghetti, as an example. And we'll put it into a container that's called a Cambro. That's a highly insulated vehicle or box, and with a liner, and they can put the spaghetti in there, and it would give us a salad and maybe a roll or something like that. We can use the ERV to pick up the meals, and we'll be able to serve on site a package, not a package meal. We'll do the packaging. We'll take a clamshell and take a scoop of the spaghetti or whatever, and a scoop of the salad, and using tongs, the bread, and then packaging it in the clamshell, and then giving it to the customer. So that's going to be different. We're going to be having some run-throughs and some practices. So a completely different environment than where we were 2 years ago. The other thing that we can start doing is also using pizzas. Up until now, for 2 years, we haven't served one pizza. What we can do now is order pizzas. And what are some of the things we have to think about if we're using pizzas? Anybody have any ideas? Say that we're going to have a shelter of 60 people. And we are having pizzas coming in. What do we have to think about? Okay, gloves, absolutely. The servers are going to be using gloves. Food safety is our #1 concern. Food temperatures, yes. The rule is that any food that we receive, we can use for 2 hours. If it's between the temperature of 40 and 140, it has a shelf, I'll say a shelf life of 2 hours. If it's below 40 or above 140, then the shelf life is 4 hours. Pizzas never stay at 140 for 5 minutes. So the pizza would be good for two hours that we could hand it out. Hopefully, we might have an oven that we could use, which we've had available at some of the junior highs and the high schools that we have had shelters, so we can keep things hot. And Valerie, no self-serving. We distribute the meals, so we would collect the pizzas when they were delivered. We would set up like a cafeteria line where people would come through, and we'd ask them what type of pizza they would want. We would put that on a paper plate and give them a napkin and cutlery and a drink, and give it to them then. No self-serving, no reaching in and grabbing and touching the meals. Remember that we have a 2-hour window, okay? The 2-hour window is real important if you get a lot of pizzas. There was one time I was at a fire up near Rockford. Somebody ordered 12 pizzas, and it was delivered by the pizza company. And they came in and said, got 12 pizzas, they're all different. What do you have to do to keep track of when that pizza came in? We needed to mark each box of that pizza when it expired. And if we had some left over past the expiration date, then we had to move those out of the way and not serve those. Jim says food allergies. Exactly. If sometimes if it's a new response, sometimes if it's like celiac disease, it's really, really hard for us to have an alternative for that. After the first meal, however, we'll be looking at making sure that food allergies and food preferences are being met. If it was an ingredient, let's say that you couldn't eat green peppers, then we'd make sure we would ask them if they had any food allergies, and then give them the best choice based on what their food allergy was. Any questions? Tanya.
That was by accident.
Oh, that's okay. 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 Couple things that we're doing every month is that we contact restaurants, and we'll be starting that up in the Moline area in April to contact different restaurants in that response area to see if we can find sources for meals, find restaurants that are willing to do meals for us, either packaged or not packaged. And there's a form on the exchange. It's a restaurant survey that gives us all the information about the restaurant, whether or not they have backup power, what lead time do they need, what's the different large volume meals that they could service or provide us, at what cost, contact information, things like that. So if anybody would be interested to join up with the response area 4 and do call downs to different restaurants, you know, put your name in the chat or send me a note. We'll do that. Do you utilize an on-call schedule, or how do you gather your employees, volunteers? Couple different ways. Usually it's by email and by text. We have a text blast and an email blast that we can send out within just a few minutes by response area. So if there was a bad fire in Rockford, every feeding member would get a email and a text in response area 1, alerting them that there was an event going on. And that, you know, basically very similar to DAT calls. If you're available, you know, contact whoever is the lead feeder on the schedule. There's 5 of us, and they would, or your DPM, and the DPM would get a hold of myself or Jamie Winterbottom, who is my cohort here in response area 4, 5, and 6, and then we'd call everybody and recruit you. How long are they out? Georgia.
I think that was in response to the food, like how long the food could be out.
Oh, okay.
Unless, Georgia, if that's incorrect, you can speak up.
No, that was correct.
Okay. If it, I'll just restate that so it's a little clearer. If we get it from a restaurant and it's like pizza or maybe hot dogs or something like that, that's not going to be hotter than 140 degrees. The shelf life is 2 hours from the time that we receive it. That's assuming it's coming from someplace close. One person said, gee, down in Louisiana, there wasn't a local restaurant available more than an hour away. Well, that hour is part of that 2-hour period. So we would only have for pizzas an hour to distribute if it was coming from an hour away. That's usually not the case in our responses here in Illinois. If, however, it's a large amount, if it's in a Cambro or an insulated package, it's at 140 degrees, it can be kept for 4 hours. Or we do temperature checks. The IRVs have instant read thermometers that we use minimally every hour. And when it dips below 140 degrees, that's when the 2-hour window starts. No more than 4 hours from being picked up to the last time that we can serve the product. And that's pretty much standard food safety temperatures. On the other side, 40 degrees if it's below 40, if it's dairy. Same thing, 4 hours if it's kept at 40 degrees. If it's left out on a counter, it's 2 hours. And we would mark it on the counter, on the container itself, when that 2 hours would be up. And then you could just look at it and go, oh, we've got 10 more minutes for this milk that's been sitting out. That's even if it's in a small ice bath that would keep it cool. We can't guarantee it'll be less than 40 degrees for all of the milk. So we would just give it a 2-hour window. Okay. All right. We have just a couple more minutes. Anybody, any other questions?
I have a question. I'm curious to how it works. I was at a DR, a large DR. It was a non-congregate. I wasn't helping in feeding, but I noticed that the feeding, they brought food in, but they had a lot of the clients helping with the feeding. How do you go about getting the clients and utilizing the clients to help with feeding? And can we still do that in COVID?
Okay. In COVID, yes and no. I hate to say yes and no. Each individual client and circumstance would be different. If it was non-congregate, in other words, if we had people in hotels, we could utilize helpers, move packaged meals, as long as they were masked and gloved, and they would just help us position the meals for delivery at the different hotels and things like that. The Red Cross feeding team would be the actual people handing the meals, distributing the meals to the client. In a congregate shelter, we have utilized them again, maybe serving, handing out snacks, handing out water. If they were gloved and with an apron, something like that, they could serve pizza under the direction of the Red Cross. They'd be considered a day volunteer, and there'd be a little safety training involved. So again, each event would be different, but I've seen that done as well, where we can utilize some of the feeding or the clients that are there. It's always great to get them involved because they get involved and they get something out of it as well. Okay, we've got about 3 minutes left. Any other comments? Valerie.
If you'd like, I'll share a little story about how we impact our clients.
Absolutely.
When we were at the Woodridge tornado last year, and about the second day in, a woman came in totally disheveled and just looking like she was in shock. She had been sitting in her house, in her lower level of the house, no water, no food, no electricity for those 2 days because her roof was blown off and she just didn't know where to go. Her husband was handicapped and he said, "You've got to go find us food." So she showed up at our shelter. We gave her lunch and encouraged her to come back for dinner. She said when she came back for dinner that her husband said, "Oh, can you go ask those ladies? This was a wonderful meal. I'd like to, have another one." She came back the next day, a completely different person, got lunch and dinner for her husband. By the third day, she was completely cleaned up and advocating for her neighbors. So it was just the kindness of us coming in and being able to just sort of set her straight, get a meal. And so she was able to start thinking about what would go next. She was talked to by some of our people for client intake. The person that came in the first day was completely different than the person that came in 3 days later.
That's a great story. That's a great story. And that did bring up something else that we do. We
also do distributed feeding using the emergency response vehicles. We had 2 teams go out every day for 5 days at that tornado site, distributing meals to the local areas where the tornado damage had occurred. And
Hank,
while
we're losing you. Can you get a little closer again?
How's that?
Much better.
Okay, sorry about that. Where we were distributing food where the actual tornado damage was, and people were cleaning up, and they would take a break and have a lunch, and then they could go back to work, and that's called distributed feeding. So that's another vehicle of the feeding team. Tanya asks, I'd like to be part of the feeding team. Fabulous. What you need to do is go into the exchange and look for Feeding Gap, and there's like 4 classes that are all available on Edge, and then reach out to Jacob. I'm trying to remember what they are. Reach out to Jacob, and he will get your gap assigned, and then you're automatically part of the team. Also, you could send me an email, hank.welch3@redcross.org, and I'll make sure and I'll answer any questions you might have. And that is the time limit. So if Jasmine has posted the meeting links, so if you want to go ahead, and we'll go back to the main meeting. Thank you so much, everybody. And Tanya, you can stop recording. And Valerie, you had one more comment?
No, sorry, I forgot to take it off.
That's all right. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I hope you got something out of this session. Thank you.